Greetings. So I was watching the Orthodox Moor's new video, which he put out yesterday, on the argument for Kumbaya being Hebrew, as found in Dante Fortson's book titled Undeniable. That video was actually part of a much larger discussion which had aired on Berean TV the day before, and I'll link to both videos in the description. I'll link to all my sources there. But watching that discussion, I felt an urge to make a short video which covers a few bits of interesting trivia which I thought might be worth documenting and adding to the conversation. But this is going to be a short and lighthearted video, I hope. The first thing I wanted to comment on is the attempt to interpret Kumbaya as Hebrew in that relevant book, Undeniable. You see, it breaks it into three elements. The first element is kum, which is the verb to rise in the imperative, which is to say when you command or ask someone else to rise, right? And quick note on this, when discussing this verb, and I've discussed this in the past, I often like to compare how Joshua 7:13 is rendered in the Qumran fragment, 4Q47, this is a Dead Sea Scroll fragment. As in that fragment, that verb, kum, in Joshua 7:13, the verb to rise in the imperative, is written with a wa as a mater lectionis, which fits well with the ancient transliteration we find in Mark 5:41, which renders the same verb in the feminine imperative as kumi. Now, I only share this to show that there is ancient evidence, considerable ancient evidence in favor of this Hebrew verb in the imperative being pronounced kum, with a u vocalization. But anyway, that aside, and getting back to this attempt to interpret Kumbaya as Hebrew as found in the book Undeniable, like I said, the first element is treated as kum, and then the third element at the end, ya, is proposed to be a truncation of the tetragrammaton. And I'd say that so far those two are pretty much straightforward and universal amongst attempts to interpret Kumbaya as Hebrew. However, where I think it goes off the rails is with that second element. See, declaring that ba doesn't have any meaning alone in Hebrew and proposing that it might be an abbreviation of Abba or father, that, for me, that really strained credulity. And you'll notice that the first element at the top and the third element at the bottom both have numbered references to Strong's Concordance. And I would say that the second element, which is in the middle, lacking any recourse to Strong's, is probably due to Strong's perhaps not discussing prefix prepositions, which would honestly highlight a problem with trying to rely on Strong's Concordance when discussing Hebrew constructions. Now, as a disclaimer, I don't believe Kumbaya is Hebrew, but if I could recommend a different course of action for those who want to argue that it is, I would recommend that they use Genesis 15:6 as a model. You see, when Genesis 15:6 says he believed in the Lord, this is how the Hebrew text reads. Now, I don't know how you, the viewer, would prefer that I pronounce the tetragrammaton, but going with different pronunciations of the name of God, or I suppose we could pronounce that phrase there as He'emin by Yahweh, or He'emin by Yehovah, or He'emin by Yehovah, or if you'd prefer that we not pronounce the tetragrammaton, we could say He'emin by Adonai. But the pronunciation of the tetragrammaton aside, the salient point here is the structure of the phrase. So let me color code the different elements within it. You see, so what I'll do is I'll mark the verb in red, the preposition in blue, and the tetragrammaton, which is to say the name of God, in yellow. And if one is going to propose that Kumbaya is Hebrew, they could construct a statement that follows that same pattern, that has that same structure, with kum as the verb, ba as the preposition prefixed to the tetragrammaton, and then ya as a truncated tetragrammaton. And this construction would mean rise in Yah, or rise with the Lord, or rise with Yah. Now, I'm not endorsing this interpretation, but if one is going to insist on Hebrew, I think this approach would seem to fit better than what the page we just looked at was proposing. But moving on from that, I now want to offer a super brief comment on the Library of Congress source that became a major part of the discussion with Orthodox Moors.
I'm trying to figure out what is your argument about the Kumbaya song, and what's your argument about Dante putting it? What's the argument?
Leo, tell him the argument.
What's the argument? What's the argument that you are?
The argument is a pseudo always dies at his own source.
That's not the argument what we were talking about.
So the book they were looking at referenced a source from the Library of Congress, and much of the discussion went on to show how that source from the Library of Congress actually undermined the argument that Kumbaya is Hebrew. But in that discussion, they only looked at the text of the relevant article. What no one did was look at the cover of the relevant document. So just for fun, I'd like to look at that cover now. The source that was referenced was this summer and fall of 2010 issue of Folklife Center News, which is a journal or magazine, basically a periodical published by the Library of Congress. And I thought it might be fun to look at the cover of this issue because Kumbaya appears right next to some Hebrew letters, right? I imagine some might be tempted to ask, what's going on there? Why are Hebrew letters appearing right beside Kumbaya on the cover of this periodical put out by the Library of Congress? Well, the reality is that this juxtaposition is because one article in this issue is about Kumbaya, while a totally separate article therein is about Yiddish radio. So those Hebrew letters were for the writing of Yiddish. So I'm sorry if this was a bit of a silly segue, but I found the juxtaposition fun in light of the topic, and I wanted to make sure it was pointed out. I imagine some might still feel like it's some sort of wink or something like that. But we can now move on from that and get to the final thing that I wanted to cover in this short video, which was a proposal that the Orthodox Moor made in the live chat of his video. He had proposed that as a thought experiment, he might explore the plausibility of Kumbaya being Arabic rather than Hebrew. And this is an idea that he's floated in the past, and it's one that I consider particularly interesting. Now, while my approach to this sort of thought experiment will differ a bit from Moor's approach, insofar that I'm going to propose a different construction from what he might propose, I'd nonetheless like to offer a preliminary proposal. Now, before I do that, however, let me first note that in the earliest recording of Kumbaya, which is from 1926, in that recording, the first syllable is pronounced kam rather than kum. And that makes sense as it's actually the English word come. Kumbaya is the English phrase come by here in the Gullah dialect. I need you, Lord, come by ya. Then I need you, Lord, come by ya. Then I need you, Lord, come by ya. Oh, Lord, come by ya. Okay, so with that in mind, I'd now like to note this Arabic language article which appears on a Islamic website, and I'll share a link in the video description. So this article was discussing the pledge of Aqaba, which is an event from early Islamic history in which a number of Arabs pledged allegiance to Muhammad, more specifically to his religion, and really they were pledging themselves to God, right? Because they were vowing to abstain from idolatry or polytheism and to avoid committing adultery and to abandon the practice of infanticide and so on, right? And there were apparently multiple such pledges of allegiance at Aqaba. So this article asks this question, Kumbaya. Now, the fuller question is Kumbayatin hadasat and al-Aqabati, how many pledges were given at Aqaba, but I just wanted to focus on those first two words, Kumbaya. Literally, how many pledges, but perhaps we could treat it more loosely as meaning how many pledges were given, how many pledged allegiance, right, in the sense of how many people pledged allegiance. So, or how many, whatever the case, how many pledges were given, how many pledges is basically what it means, Kumbaya. So with that in mind, let's consider three interpretations of the phrase Kumbaya, the English interpretation, the Hebrew interpretation, and the Arabic interpretation. Let's consider them in light of some of the lyrics of the song. Now, of course, ultimately, the phrase is easiest to explain as the English phrase come by here, right? Again, in the Gullah dialect. Now, that seems to be the most obvious conclusion, and it was argued persuasively in Moor's video. But nonetheless, looking at these lyrics, when we have the English interpretation, we have, now I need you, Lord, come by here. Sinners need you, Lord, come by here. Oh, Lord, come by here. Come by here, Lord, come by here. Right? And that's pretty straightforward. But now let's instantiate a proposed Hebrew phrase into those lyrics in place of the English phrase come by here. Suddenly, the lyrics become, now I need you, Lord, rise with Yah. Sinners need you, Lord, rise with Yah. Oh, Lord, rise with Yah. Rise with Yah, Lord, rise with Yah. And honestly, that feels a bit awkward. However, if we instantiate the proposed Arabic phrase instead, we get these lyrics. Now I need you, Lord. How many have pledged? Sinners need you, Lord. But how many have pledged? Oh, Lord, how many have pledged? How many have pledged, Lord? How many have pledged? Now, I hope it's obvious that I think the English option works best, but the Arabic just might be a little less awkward than the Hebrew. And at the very least, it's an interesting thought experiment which was worth exploring in this short video. It's like it's saying everyone needs God, but how many have had their own sort of Aqaba moment and pledged allegiance to a life of faith, right? That's interesting to me. But like I said, that was just a thought experiment. I look forward to alternative proposals, whether from the Orthodox Moor or anyone else. And with that, I'll close this short video here. I hope you found it as fun as I did. I want to say again, I intended this lightheartedly. But feel free to share any comments, questions, or criticisms. And God bless.